Hey everybody, Dr. West here. So these next two lectures are going to cover chapter 15, and the two after that are going to cover actually the previous chapter, which is chapter 14. But altogether, the four of them are going to cover what we would call cognitive psychology. So this is the idea of things that happen within our brain that we would consider to be things that are almost related to the idea of kind of thinking, but also memory, things that make us more human versus anything else. So other things like language and intelligence and all that kind of stuff is going to be rolled into this concept of cognition. These next two lectures, 4 and 5, you are going to hear from another individual in the department, the third person that helped co-create the brain and behavior course many years ago. Again, I know other individuals teach it now today, but originally when there were three of us creating it, it was me and Dr. Bennett and Dr. Levins. And so this particular lecture, you're going to hear from Dr. Levins, and she's going to talk to you about cognitive constructs. And then in the next lecture, you're going to hear Dr. Levins again talking about some other topics related to the idea of cognitive asymmetry. So again, she's going to talk you through some of these things. You will also see that she's going to show you some videos throughout. I have edited the videos just a little bit. Some of them were a little bit long, so you'll see that it kind of fades in and out from some of her videos. If you would like to go back and watch the full length of the video, I have made those links still available in the PDFs, so you're welcome to go back and watch those. But anyway, enjoy and let me know if you have any questions.
For chapter 15, we're going to cover how the brain thinks. We're going to review the nature of thought, cognition, and the association cortex. What are some of the fields that are involved in expanding the frontiers of cognitive neuroscience? We're also going to talk about cerebral asymmetry in thinking. We're going to go over gender and handedness variations in cognitive organization. And then finally, we're going to be reviewing intelligence and consciousness. So beginning with the nature of thought, when we think of thought, we tend to think really sort of metaphysically, similar to the I think, therefore I am. But when we delve into the definition of a thought on a psychological or neural level, thought is actually a psychological construct. Specifically, it is an idea resulting from a set of impressions that some mental ability exists as an entity. Examples include memory, language, and emotion. It's difficult to localize constructs in the brain, so we don't really have a specific place for memory. We don't really have a specific place for emotion. We don't really have a very specific place for language. While there are key processing regions in the brain involved in language, it's not just one thing. In order for you to process and speak language, it's a host of regions that are involved in that construct. Similarly, there's no one place where memories are stored, or there's no one place where emotions are processed. There are a couple of regions that are essential for forming new memories, primarily the hippocampus, and the amygdala is very important for processing psychologically relevant stimuli, which tends to be emotional stimuli. But there is no region that just processes emotion, and there's no particular place where you can go and access stored memories. This diffuse representation makes it really difficult to localize constructs in the brain. Cognition is actually an act or process of knowing or coming to know. So in psychology, cognition is used to refer to the process of thought. So we have explicit memories, things that we tend to think about consciously that we recall. This tends to be what we think about when we think about cognition. And we will think about particular events, process information, come to realize particular behaviors or events have meaning. So this is generally what we think about, but it's not bound only to explicit or conscious information. You can also have a process of knowing or coming to know at the unconscious or implicit level, which would really refer to the fact that your body is also processing things and your brain is processing things that you're not necessarily aware of. So when you're learning to ride a bike, then there are certain things that your body does, processes that it engages that you are not aware of, but your body is still engaging in that process of coming to know something or how to do something. So cognition does not just refer to things that you are consciously aware of. One of the key characteristics of human thought is language. Language gives humans a fundamental edge in thinking. Language provides the brain with a way to categorize information. This is really important. So when you see something, you see a dog, then you can think about the various ways that it can be categorized. It's categorized as a pet, an animal, a mammal. If you see a cow, then you would categorize the cow as an animal, bovine, particular type of animal. You might categorize a cow as something that could be eaten and made into meat. And we wouldn't necessarily think that way about dogs, although in some cultures that would actually be different. So language provides this fundamental way to categorize information so that we know how to think about and organize what we are encountering in the world. Language also provides a means of organizing time. Monday at 3 p.m. So this could be a future time, this could be a past time. And humans have a fundamental ability above and beyond most animals to organize time. Some animals have the ability to look in terms of the past and maybe to short expectations with regards to the future. Animals will store food, for example, for a later time. But humans have a much more complex way of organizing time so that we can pursue complicated long-term goals. Language also has syntax, ways in which words are put together to form phrases, clauses, or sentences. This is proposed to be a unique characteristic of human language, and it helps humans communicate and make sense with regards to what someone is saying so that the correct meaning is derived. Syntax also allows humans to have a language that moves beyond the concrete world of the here and now. There's certain elements of syntax that denote future tense, past tense, and provide us with this ability to communicate across time and space. So a fundamental question is, how is it that thoughts actually arise in the brain? We all have thoughts. We think about all sorts of things. The people that we love, the people that we don't like, our hopes, our dreams, the things that we're afraid of. And what is interesting is that at a very basic level, neurons, the firing or non-firing of neurons, is the foundation of thought and cognitive processes in the brain. So thoughts actually have a very physical representation. In order for you to have a thought, there must be some physical change, some physical instance that is occurring to correspond to that thought. So neurons must be either firing or not firing, or you can have a change of the rate of firing, which would correspond to something else. You could have more firing in one area and less in another. The neurons that would fire or not fire to comprise a thought are known as cell assemblies. So multiple neurons converge to form cell assemblies to represent complex thought. Cell assemblies provide the basis for cognition. You have different ensembles that come together, much like words and language, to produce coherent thoughts. So also, just like you would have different instruments, that one instrument would just provide one tone, one musical quality, but when you put multiple instruments together, then you have way more than the sum of its parts, and you can have a much more complex communication of musical harmony. So cell assemblies basically correspond to the neurons that are involved in representing a particular piece of information. So if you were to think of a little dog, and you have in your mind a little dog, then there's all sorts of neurons that would be firing. They would be neurons involved with the auditory information associated with a small dog, the type of way that they fire, visual information, what a small dog would look like, also what a small dog would feel like. You might have particular memories and associations if you have a small dog or if you've owned one in the past. People also tend to differ in how representative they think little dogs are of dogs more generally. So I, for example, am more of a big dog person, and some people are more of a small dog person. Primarily my experiences with dogs have been bigger dogs. And I also have cats. And so I happen to have large cats. So when I see really small dogs, they don't seem very much like dogs to me if they are smaller than my cats, because there's an element of size that can be associated with the stereotypical dog. So all of those different features that I mentioned, the sound, the touch, the visual aspects, personal episodic memories and experiences, there are neurons that are firing when you see or even think about that information. So that particular ensemble of neurons, that particular collection, that would be a cell assembly. And so you would have a distributed collection of neurons across the brain that, when activated, would mean that a particular thought is currently active in your brain right now. And so that is basically a cell assembly. And that is also the neural foundation of thinking, that when we are engaging in the act of thinking about information, our neurons are firing in a particular pattern that corresponds with the particular information that we're thinking about. Building on this, neurons are the only elements in the brain that combine evidence and make decisions. So when we have various thoughts floating around in our mind, we're trying to focus on one particular thought over another, then neurons are firing that correspond with those thoughts. And the thoughts that receive the majority of our attention, of our cognitive resources, they are going to most likely be more active, or those particular cell assemblies are going to be more active to represent the maintenance of that particular information. And if we're trying to actually make decisions from what we would like for dinner, or what we would want for a snack, how much money we want to spend, typically when we do that, we have multiple pieces of information or thoughts that we're choosing between. And when we are in the act of choosing, some particular possibilities are more active or less active than others. So we could be in particular mood for one type of snack or one type of dinner. And so that representation will actually be more active. The neurons will be firing more often. The neurons will be firing stronger. And when we make decisions, we might be looking for that type of increased signal. This is basically known as signal detection theory. And that's one of the things that our brain does, is it looks for the presence of signal versus non-signal. So when we make choices where our neurons are looking for firing from other neurons or non-firing from other neurons, something being on or something being off. And that difference will enable information from multiple regions of the brain to be assimilated so that neurons can combine evidence and make decisions. So now that you have a basic idea of the role of neurons in thought and how you have cell assemblies that can be distributed throughout the brain, the next thing we want to understand a little bit more about is where some of these cell assemblies would be. So we have particular regions of the brain that are involved in processing sensory information: the primary visual cortex, the primary auditory cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, the primary motor cortex. So these, at a fundamental level, process incoming sensory stimuli or direct movement. but most of the things that we do combine sensory information so that what we're processing is actually multimodal. And where this information gets combined is in association cortices or association cortex. Association cortex is the neocortex outside the primary sensory and motor cortices that functions to produce cognitions. So it is in the association cortex that you would have cell assemblies that would combine multimodal information from different sensories. The association cortex receives information that is more highly processed than information received by the primary cortices. So in the primary cortex, for example, you might process basic visual information regarding shading, color, light intensity, and then you move out into the secondary visual processing or the extrastriate cortex, and you will start to combine that information so that you will have more complex visual features. When you move into the association cortex, then you might be combining visual information and auditory information so that you have more complex representations still. You might be combining visual and auditory information so that you have even more complex thoughts and cognitions. The temporal association region is one of the primary association cortex. It produces cognition related to visual and auditory processing. The parietal cortex, this is related to somatosensory processing and movement control. So this is particularly important for attention and spatial processing. And then you have the frontal cortex. This coordinates information from the parietal and temporal association regions with information coming from subcortical regions, such as the amygdala. So you have, I guess, three primary association cortices: the temporal association regions, the parietal association regions, and the frontal cortex regions. The biggest association area of all is your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes, aside from the primary motor cortex, is a very large region of the brain that doesn't actually engage in any primary sensory processing. So it really just organizes and associates lots of information. So the frontal cortex is basically a very, very large association cortex. So now that we have this information that's coming in from the multiple sensory regions, how is it that we actually bind this information together? So this is known as a binding problem. How does the brain tie varied sensory and motor events together into a unified perception or behavior? So we have our unified perception of a dog. Well, again, that contains all sorts of sensory and motor information that would be processed in the primary sensory regions of the brain. So how does this come together? Regions of the association cortex are multimodal. The neurons in association cortex respond to information from more than one sensory modality. So basically what this means is that if you have a representation of a dog, and this representation of a dog would correspond to a cell assembly in one of your association cortices. And if you were to think about what are the things that activate or make you think about a dog with this representation, you could hear the sound the dog makes. And if you hear a dog barking, then that will call to mind a dog. It could be a particular type of dog. It could be your own. You could see a picture of a dog. You could see a dog sitting across from you. So that would also activate your representation of a dog. And you could also feel a dog in terms of pet it. So you have these three different types of senses, and even if you were to hear or if you were to see the dog or a picture of a dog, then both of the sensory information would activate this multimodal representation. And most more complex thinking uses multimodal neurons. So spatial cognition, attention planning, all use multimodal neurons in the association cortex because it's very, very important to combine information from across the senses so that you can recognize information that you're seeing in the environment quickly and be able to respond to it quickly. Now we're going to be delving more into some of the types of higher order thought processes that you can have. So one of them is spatial cognition. Spatial cognition refers to a range of mental functions from the ability to navigate from point A to point B to the representation of complex visual arrays. So if you were to walk on campus and someone were to walk up to you, a visitor, and ask you to give them directions to a particular place, then you would be giving them verbal directions that would correspond with spatial information. And you could take this verbal information and use it to navigate in space from point A to point B. This is a key element of spatial cognition. The ability to mentally manipulate things likely evolved in parallel with our ability to navigate space. If you think about when you give people directions about where to walk or where to drive, that you tend to navigate through that space mentally as you do it. So you might sort of picture yourself walking in the space or what you would do. So this mental navigation is key for our spatial cognition, and it is also highly relevant for when we're actually going to manipulate things that are in front of us. So to give you an example, are these shapes, the ones that I'm about to show, the same or different? So chances are that when I showed these to you on the screen and I said these are same or different, that you would pause for a second. And in order to tell if they were the same or the different, you would probably manipulate this one. And so you might actually rotate it so that it would be standing in a similar position as this one. And then you could more accurately compare them. That mental rotation ability, highly linked with our ability to also navigate space. So spatial cognition is probably especially enhanced in athletes as they need to have a very high ability to navigate space and to mentally manipulate where they are with respect to other people, where they intend to be, where they're going to throw the ball, the particular movements they're going to do. So spatial cognition is very, very important for these things. The next cognitive construct that is particularly important is attention. Attention is probably one of the more interesting psychological constructs. Most people have an idea of what they think attention means, that you're going to focus more on one thing than another. And the layperson definition of attention largely coincides, but the scientific definition or the psychological definition of attention goes much more in depth. So attention is the selective narrowing or focusing of awareness to part of the sensory environment or to a class of stimuli. You'll learn more about attention in human cognitive factors should you take that class. There are all different types of attention that people can have. People don't realize, for example, that again, this selective narrowing or focusing, you can actually narrow your attention, you can broaden your attention. You have covert attention that you try to hide. You have overt attention when you would look at something really directly. So there's different types of attention. And one of the things that we don't realize when we're first learning about attention is how we have way, way more information that comes in from the environment that we can possibly actually process. So some of the key elements of attention are winnowing down, selectively winnowing down what information we should spend our cognitive resources on processing and what information is not so important. Deficits of attention have become increasingly common and important. Deficits of attention tend to be linked to the frontal association cortex. Damage to the frontal association cortex can lead to focusing excessively on external stimuli, as well as difficulty shifting attention. This can be particularly excessive in individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder. Attention is also, of course, linked with attention deficit disorder, some learning disorders, and there is some thoughts that mental disorders such as depression might be influenced by how much attention individuals give to positive or negative information. We also have the parietal association cortex. Damage to the parietal association cortex can actually lead to a very unique condition known as contralateral neglect, When you have contralateral neglect, which is also known as unilateral neglect, then an individual who has this condition ignores a part of the body or world on the opposite side or contralateral side of the brain injury. Neglect tends to be most severe in right hemisphere damaged individuals. So if you have damage to your right parietal lobes, then you are more likely to experience unilateral neglect. And so you will learn more about unilateral neglect in this neat little video right here.
Unlike Graham, Peggy Palmer has normal vision. She should be able to copy this star easily.
I'll never get this star, hopelessly.
But something odd is happening. One whole side of the star is missing. Peggy has a condition called visual neglect. Although her eyesight is fine, half of her visual world no longer seems to matter. 10 years ago, Peggy suffered a stroke in the parietal lobes of her brain.
So that was a really nice illustration of unilateral neglect. Unilateral neglect has a couple of different names. They all refer to the same thing. Unilateral neglect, hemispatial neglect, visual neglect, contralateral neglect. They all refer to the fact that you are neglecting one half of your body or your visual or mental world. Neglect is really interesting because it tells us a lot about attention and how information is bound together for the process of attention. When people have visual neglect, their visual processing regions are fine. So there's nothing wrong with their primary visual processing regions. It is when sensory information needs to actually get combined and come together into one more comprehensive image or representation in the world that individuals with neglect run into problems, because they're basically not able to form that unified representation. And since they cannot form that unified representation, then they don't have it on that whole one side of their body. So she was asked to draw Daisy from memory. So not only would she neglect this one whole side of her memory, she would also neglect things in space. So if someone were to call out her name, she would have a great deal of trouble orienting towards her left-hand side. If the person were on her right, she would turn towards them to the right. If they were on the left, that ability to even orient or turn towards your left-hand side would be challenging. People that have very, very severe neglect can actually lose their whole awareness of the left side of their world. If they were shown the left side of their face, they would state that it would feel like an alien or a stranger looking at them. They wouldn't attend to it. They would, if you put a piece of food, plate of food in front of him, they would only see that food on one side, and they would only eat that one side, and they wouldn't see the other side. And people who have very severe neglect, so that even if you call their attention to it, they cannot see it. The woman in the video, she did not have very severe neglect when you actually called her attention to the fact that she'd only written or drawn half of a flower. You know, she didn't react that much, like, oh my gosh, I've drawn half a flower. And that didn't make her have a negative reaction. She didn't even have a real heightened reaction to it. She's like, oh, look what I've done. That is also something that is common, and that there's this sort of overall avoidance or neglect that this information is important. Lots of times when you have deficits in processing certain types of information, then your brain will not even be aware that those deficits exist, and it is adaptive for it not to get too fixated on some of those deficits. Another cognitive construct that is highly central to our human lives is planning. So we always plan. Sometimes we plan too much. Sometimes we plan too little. The primary region of the brain involved in planning is your frontal lobes. Your frontal lobes basically act like an orchestra conductor. So for example, you would select a course of action, ignore irrelevant stimuli, and remember what you have already done. If you have trouble doing any of these things, you likely have damage to your frontal lobes. And I mean excessive trouble doing some of these things. Some people are better planners than others, and there's all sorts of individual differences in that realm. But if someone has frontal lobe damage, then they can be very impaired and unable to organize their behavior. So to give you an example of that, we'll watch this video here of an individual that has frontal lobe damage.
What happens when those mental processes go awry, when damage to the brain interferes with the normal structure of human thought? In 1983, Bill Mazzal graduated in the top 10% of his law school class and passed the bar exam on the first try.
This time I want you to start with the number 101 and count back by sevens.
Today, he seems normal, but in 1984, a stroke changed his life.
101, 94, 87, 80, 73, 66, 59, 52, 45, 38, 31.
One afternoon in January, I got a phone call from Bill to say something was really wrong. It was an emergency. I needed to come home right away. So I went racing home, and I asked him what had happened. And he told me that he had just been sitting on the couch watching TV when he got this blinding pain in his head and felt very sick and could barely make it to the bedroom to collapse. Turned out to be very bad. Turned out to be an aneurysm. And the aneurysm, as I found out, is a blood vessel that balloons out and starts to bleed, which it did in Bill's head. And it was right in about the frontal lobe area. That's where the bleeding occurred, is in the frontal lobe area.
Right.
It was very sudden, it was very scary, and neither of us had any idea what was happening to us, what was happening to our lives, what was happening to our future.
It may be very hard to appreciate exactly what is wrong with somebody with frontal lobe injury. There have been many studies to try and pinpoint a particular function. And in some ways, it's almost easier to characterize frontal lobe function by saying what it doesn't do. It's not the part of the brain that makes us speak. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to see. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to hear. It's not the part of the brain that allows us to touch something and recognize what that is that we just touched. It's not really by itself the part of the brain that remembers. It doesn't seem to be involved in any particularly discrete perceptual, sensory, or so-called motor function. But in spite of that, it seems to have a very critical role in how we use the kind of information that other parts of our brain are dedicated to determining.
Before the aneurysm, Bill was very organized. He could plan things sort of automatically. He was very much a planner. He could keep a million details in his head. He had an extremely good memory. He was very outgoing, very self-confident, very take charge kind of a person. Following the aneurysm, like now, Bill is still very intelligent, but he doesn't have the capacity anymore to apply that.
Bill retained, after his stroke, all of the knowledge that he had previously, but he lost his ability to problem solve. And in losing his ability to problem solve, which is what lawyering is really all about, he lost his ability to be a functioning lawyer. And, you know, there's nothing more disappointing than finding somebody as bright as he is, working with him for a couple of years, and then, you know, seeing overnight those skills just gone. You know, it really cuts deep when you see that.
Recognize these
Tinker toys.
Tinker toys. Your job is to make whatever you want with them. Okay, just get started. Anything you want.
Okay.
Because frontal lobe injury causes such subtle problems, psychologists like Muriel Lezak have devised clever ways of evaluating the damage.
In making a construction with Tinker Toys, Bill simply jumped into the task with no plan, no forethought. It had not even occurred to him to have had a goal.
overall, we're talking about the frontal lobe as an executive brain area that is responsible for integrating information that comes from many different brain systems into a purposeful plan of behavior, anticipating the future, making critical judgments, being able to survey a situation, to juggle ideas, and to choose which idea is most likely to have implications for the future.
Did you have any ideas in your head when you started doing it?
Not really. I thought, well, no. I was going to make two separate things and sort of join them together, but just any two of these together aren't real sturdy, and so I thought I'd get them together earlier.
If thinking is the process of using information to make decisions, then the frontal lobe is crucial for thinking. Without that, without the frontal lobes, we are at the mercy of our environment. We respond to events without reflection. We are unable to plan for our futures. It is this capacity, the ability to plan for the future, that distinguishes us from all other species.
So I thought that was a pretty nice example demonstrating the role of the frontal lobes and how they're particularly crucial for keeping information in mind and planning. When you do plan, you need to keep particular pieces of information in mind. That's a key element. You have to think about possible outcomes, consequences, things that you need to remember. You need to put them in a correct order so that you can enact them. Individuals with frontal lobe damage have trouble with all of these things. They might be able to tell you some of the correct steps that are involved in a process, but they're also going to have trouble ordering them. They're going to have trouble maintaining information. So if you told someone with frontal lobe damage, say like, oh, look, I need you to go get these types of things at the grocery store, they would have trouble remembering them. They might remember some of the wrong ones. If they do remember them, they would have trouble putting them in order for efficiency when you do go to the grocery store. If you have a mental list, you might automatically organize that list according to walking around the grocery store so that you would be getting all of the dairy items at once, all of the vegetable items at once, instead of going back and forth and ping-ponging around the grocery store. So if you have frontal lobe damage, then you're going to have trouble with this organized, ordered, efficient behavior. Another key element that builds on attention, even elements of spatial processing and planning and frontal lobe function is imitation and understanding. So for successful communication, the sender and the receiver must have a common understanding of what information is relevant. Mirror neurons are particularly central to this process. So when you look at what's going on with another person, if you're going to imitate them, if you're going to understand the feelings that they have, which would be elements of empathy, then you're going to use mirror neurons. Cells in the primate premotor cortex that fire when an individual observes a specific action by another individual, these are known as mirror neurons. And so they have an emotional component, a planning component, a spatial cognition component because they are highly associated with movement. So they help you interpret the actions and behaviors of other people and try to assign or give you an understanding of what their internal mental state might be while they're engaging in this particular behavior. Humans have a very high capacity to communicate with words and feel empathy. And this may have resulted from the progressive evolution of the mirror neuron system. Deficits in empathy, such as those experienced by autistic individuals, have been linked to less developed mirror neuron systems, and our own empathy with regards to other people, with regards to why we like to watch TV shows, horror movies. We often think of empathy as something that is very much linked with emotion and feeling the thoughts and feelings of someone else, but it's also linked with humor, excitement, engagement, and a general alignment of what other people are experiencing with respect to yourself. So we have another pretty neat video that goes into elements of mirror neurons.
We're instinctive copycats, and for a really good reason: survival. Now, let's see exactly how this copycat thing works on you. Are you yawning? Did you just smile? So what's going on in that head of yours? Deep in the brain's premotor cortex, we've got special cells known as mirror neurons. Why mirror? Because every time we see someone act, these neurons fire, mentally mimicking the same movements. Now here's the really freaky part. It doesn't just copy the moves, it takes on the emotion too. Feeling thirsty? You can count on it. So do advertisers who make millions each year by stimulating your mirror neuron. It's clear that our ability to empathize, to feel what others are feeling, is wired into us at the cellular level. We're going to push your mirror neurons right to the edge with master magician Matthew Holtzclaw.
Today we're going to walk around the park and introduce ourselves to people and then do some magic tricks, but also do a few things that might challenge their senses, their perceptions, possibly even their nerve ending.
This couple just thinks they're watching regular card tricks, but Matt has something more devious in mind.
I want to show you something. You get to limber yourself up. You can do these things where if you have like that kind of more flexible fingers than others, you can bend it further back. See that? Hurt like hell, but right. That hurt, right? That was crazy. How'd that feel to watch that? How's it good? Like that.
Feel that? Those are your mirror neurons at work.
Through mirror neurons, we are able to give the audience the sense of feeling what we're feeling. It is based entirely on empathy.
Think about when you watch a horror movie. What are you feeling? Those are your mirror neurons on hyperdrive. Studies show they're why viewers connect so strongly with on-screen emotions. Well, now Matt's going to amp things up with something horrific of his own.
If you have a nice sharp tool, again, it's easier. It's not so much of a magic trick as it is kind of just about pain. Stay with me. That looks all right from there, right? It was way better this way. Oh, yeah. It's kind of nasty. I think it's kind of stuck in there pretty deep. Sure. Yeah. I'm just gonna, you can see from that side, you see where it's going in there? Yeah. See that? Oh. It's pretty nasty, right? But here's what I'll do. I'm gonna pull it right out. You can have a look at it, make sure it's not like a rig thing. It's not like there's no hole here, anything like that. There's no way. So you're doing that. How'd that feel to watch that?
Painful.
Painful.
The reason you're wincing, like our subject, is because your brain just experienced the pain Matthew would have felt if he wasn't a master illusionist.
I just thought about it going in my arm.
You thought about it going in your arm?
Yeah.
When I was doing it, you could feel it pushing through?
So mirror neurons are highly, highly relevant for us understanding the actions and mental states of others. And what happens is that when we see someone else doing something or having something happen to them, then these mirror neurons, they fire and they activate the same regions that would be involved in if that action were to specifically happen to us. So this is how if you see someone else get hit, you can sort of cringe and you can almost feel a little bit of pain. Mirror neurons are, for example, the primary region that if a man sees someone get hit in the private parts, then he reacts very automatically as if that was very painful to him himself, because according to his mirror neurons, it was. So these neurons, they fire and they activate the same regions as if you yourself were going through that particular behavior or action. So this allows you to understand what other people are going through, to feel other people's pain, and it is essential for communication. We will look at other people's faces to judge their emotions and what they're feeling on the inside. And then we will also reflect back and think, well, okay, they're smiling, so my mirror neurons are going to respond to this, and they'll say that the person is smiling, and your mirror neurons, and you will also think that, therefore, that, well, when I smile, I'm happy, so they must be happy too. You have this deductive reasoning that surrounds what you see from other people to understand what might be going on inside their head.